The ferry hadn't run in 11 years. Most people in Caldwell Bay had stopped noticing the old dock long ago, the way you stop noticing a scar after enough time passes. It became part of the landscape, part of the waterline silhouette, indistinguishable from the herons that stood motionless in the shallows at dusk. The wooden planks had warped and greyed. The ticket booth, which once smelled of printed paper and someone's coffee thermos, now held nothing but the sound of wind moving through its broken window. But people still drove there. Not many. Not often. But in the way that certain places hold a quality that can't be named, something between memory and gravity, people found themselves turning down Linden's Shore Road when the weight of their lives became too specific to carry anywhere else. Miriam Calloway was 51 years old the morning she drove there. She hadn't planned to. She had been sitting in her car in the parking lot of the county courthouse for 40 minutes after she'd walked out, papers folded in her coat pocket. The kind of folded that isn't careful, just compressed, the way you compress something you don't want to look at. She had driven without music, without the radio, without even the small comfort of the heater, though October had already sharpened into something colder than she'd expected. She didn't decide to go to the dock. She simply went. And when her car finally stopped, she sat there for a long time before anything broke open. Miriam had always been the kind of woman other people described as capable. It was meant as a compliment, and she had taken it that way for most of her adult life. Capable meant she remembered things, birthdays, appointments, the names of people's children. Capable meant she could be handed a problem, even someone else's problem, and find her way through it without complaint. It was the word her mother had used. Her teachers. Later, her colleagues at the County Land Registry Office where she had worked for 23 years, cataloguing property boundaries and ownership transfers, making sure the legal record of the world matched what was actually true on the ground. There was something she had always privately loved about that work, the idea that somewhere in a drawer, in a file, there was documentation of what belonged to whom. A piece of paper that said, "This is yours." She had believed in that. She had believed in it in her marriage, too, though that belief had been quieter, less articulate. More like an assumption than a decision. She had believed that what they had built, the house on Greer Street, the savings account that had taken 15 years to reach a number that felt like safety, the retirement fund she had contributed to dutifully every month, all of that was documented. Mutual. Real in the way that legal paperwork makes things real. Her husband, Daniel, had been charming in the specific way that charming people are, which is to say, it was the thing you saw first, and it took years to understand what was behind it. Not malice, exactly. She had thought about this a great deal in recent months and had decided it wasn't malice. It was something more ordinary and in some ways harder to hold onto as an explanation. He simply had always believed that what was his, and what was hers was also his. And the difference had never troubled him because he had never truly looked at it. She had looked at it now. She had looked at it in a lawyer's office 2 weeks ago, and then again in the courthouse this morning, and she had seen clearly what had been done. The accounts, both of them, had been emptied over the course of 8 months. Not all at once, which would have been obvious. Incrementally. The retirement fund had been liquidated in February, and she had received the paperwork. But Daniel handled the finances and she had believed him when he said he had rolled it over into something better. She had not checked. She had trusted the documentation in the drawer without reading it. The divorce filing had come on a Thursday. She had been at work. Her colleague Pam had sent her a text that said only, "Call me when you can," which was the kind of message that makes your hands go cold before you even dial. She had not cried in the lawyer's office. She had not cried when she called her daughter, Sasha, who lived in Portland and who had said things that were loving and correct and which Miriam had barely heard. She had not cried when she called the bank and confirmed, in the polite and careful language of a woman who has spent her life being capable, what she already knew. She cried at the ferry dock. She sat in her car on Linden Shore Road, looked at the broken ticket booth and the grey water and the warped planks extending over nothing useful anymore. And she cried in the way that she had not allowed herself to cry in a very long time, without editing, without the awareness of what her face was doing. And when it passed, the way those things eventually pass, she sat very still. And she noticed something she had not seen in years. She had been here before, of course. Everyone who had grown up in Caldwell Bay had been here before. The dock had been running until she was 40, and she had taken the ferry across to Inlet Point at least 100 times in her life, for the summer market. For the lighthouse walks her mother used to organize, once for a concert she could no longer name, with someone she could no longer entirely picture. But she had been here specifically, once, in a way that mattered. She had been here with her father. She was 24. He was 61, which she now realized was a decade younger than she would have thought of as old, but which had seemed, at 24, to be simply the age fathers were. He had driven her here on a Sunday in late November, and they had sat in his truck, not her car, not anywhere like this, but close enough that the body remembers, and he had talked to her about money. It was strange to remember it now. He had never been comfortable talking about money. Her family had not been comfortable with the topic in general. Money was something that existed in the background of decisions, rarely discussed directly, like the structural walls of a house that you trusted without inspecting. But that Sunday, he had talked. He had told her that he had opened a savings account for her when she was 7 years old, that he had put in $20 a month for the first 10 years, and then 30, and then more when he could. That it was not much, he had used that phrase several times, it's not much, but that it was hers, and that she should not let anyone else's name onto the account, ever. Because what is yours should be documented as yours and not confused with anyone else's life. She had listened politely and immediately, upon returning home, told Daniel about the account. She had not thought about that conversation in years. Not deliberately. It had sunk into the sediment of her memory the way things do when you believe they are settled, when you believe they don't require revisiting because the matter has been decided. Now she thought about it. The morning light was doing something slow and pale over the water. The ferry dock creaked in a small wind, a sound that was almost rhythmic, almost conversational. A great blue heron stood on one of the far pilings, perfectly still, watching the water with the patience of something that does not need to make decisions. Miriam sat with her hands in her lap. She thought, he told me not to put anyone else's name on it. She tried to remember if she had. She could not remember. She genuinely, with effort, could not remember whether she had, at 25 or 26 or whatever year it had been, added Daniel's name to that account. The way she had added his name to every other account as they merged their financial lives together and called it partnership. She tried to think about where the documentation would be. Her father had died 6 years ago. Her mother had died 2 years after that. The house had been sold. The contents had been divided or donated or left for Miriam's sister in Tacoma to sort through, because Miriam had not been able to make herself go back for the final clearing. She sat at the ferry dock and tried to think about where papers would be kept. Her sister's name was Clara. She was 58, 7 years older than Miriam, and she lived in a house that was organized in the way that people organize houses when they have made peace with keeping things. Clara kept things. She kept birthday cards going back 30 years, school photographs, utility bills from the 1990s that she held onto for reasons she could not articulate beyond. You never know. Miriam called her from the car, still parked at the dock. I need to ask you something, Miriam said. I heard about Daniel, Clara said first. Sasha called me. Okay. Are you somewhere safe? I'm at the old ferry dock. There was a pause that was not uncomfortable, exactly. But that held something in it, the particular pause of an older sister who has learned not to ask certain questions directly. Dad's green box, Miriam said. Do you still have it? The green box was a metal lockbox, small enough to carry with one hand, with a hinged lid and a lock that used a key that had been on her father's keyring for as long as Miriam could remember. When he died, her mother had given the key to Clara without explanation, which was the kind of thing their mother did. She distributed objects according to an internal logic she never explained, trusting that the right thing would find the right use. Yes, Clara said slowly. I have it. I've had it in the closet in the guest room. I never opened it because I didn't think it was I didn't know what was in it. You have the key? I have the key. Miriam stared at the water. Can I come? She drove to Tacoma the same day. 4 hours. She stopped once for gas and once for coffee, and she thought about her father the entire way, not in the way grief usually surfaces, which is jagged and sudden, but in the longer, slower way. The way you think about someone when you are trying to reconstruct them from what they left behind. Her father had been a quiet man, a postal worker for 34 years. He had driven the same route 5 days a week and had known the names of dogs along the route and had, near the end of his career, brought small dog treats in his bag as a matter of daily habit. He was not a dramatic man. He was not a man who made speeches or declarations. He expressed love through the maintenance of things, through showing up, through keeping the small commitments that most people don't notice because they are too consistent to notice. She had loved him steadily and taken him for granted in the way that steady love makes you take things for granted. She had not cried when she arrived at Clara's. They sat at the kitchen table. The green box was between them, exactly as she remembered, a little dented on one corner, with a strip of electrical tape along the hinge that had been there since at least the 1980s. Clara slid the key across the table. Miriam's hand rested on the lid for a moment. Not hesitation, exactly. Something more careful. She was aware that what she was about to do was reach into the part of her life she had stopped looking at, the part before Daniel, before the marriage, before the decisions that had accumulated into a life she could not entirely recognize anymore. She turned the key. Inside the box were three things. The first was a folded sheet of paper, account information for a savings account at Harmon Federal Credit Union, in Miriam's name only. The kind of small institution that doesn't get bought and sold. The account number was written in her father's handwriting, which was the careful, deliberate handwriting of someone who learned to write at a time when handwriting was taught as a skill. The second was a small ledger, the kind with the marble pattern cover, the kind that used to be sold at every stationery store. Inside it were columns of dates and numbers going back to 1979. Deposits. Every month. Her father's handwriting again, each entry exact. The third was a letter. It was addressed to her. It was dated 11 years ago, which would have made him 72, which meant he had written it not long before his decline began, before the strokes that took his speech first. Then his mobility, then finally him. She read it slowly. It was not long. Her father had not been a man of long written communications. But it was complete in the way that certain short things are complete, like a room that has everything necessary and nothing extra. He wrote that he had started the account when she was born. Not 7. Born. He had told her 7 because he hadn't wanted her to feel weighted by it. He had wanted it to feel like a practical adult thing, not a lifelong project. But he had been putting money in since 1972. For 51 years, in the arithmetic of the present, though for 40 when he wrote the letter. He wrote that he had seen, early in her marriage, that Daniel was the kind of man who believes that what is near him belongs to him. He had not said this to her because she was happy, and because saying it would have either damaged something that could have been fine or planted a seed of doubt in something that might have grown right. He had written that he hoped he was wrong. He had written that he had spent many years hoping he was wrong. He had not been wrong. He wrote that the account had never had another name on it. He had been explicit with the credit union. He had spoken with a manager, whose name he had written down in the margin, that this account was never to be modified without his presence or a letter from Miriam herself, confirmed by phone call. He had called the credit union twice a year to confirm. 4 decades. He had called them twice a year, quietly, without telling anyone, to make sure the small thing he had built for his daughter was still intact. The final line of the letter read, "I don't know if you'll need this. I hope you don't. But I wanted you to have something that was only ever yours." Miriam read it once. Then she sat with it in her hands for a long time, and neither she nor Clara said anything, because there was nothing to say that would fit inside language right then. She went the following morning. Harmon Federal Credit Union was a small building on the edge of a neighborhood that had been modest in the 1970s and had not changed much. There was a flag outside. There was a sign in the window about holiday hours. Inside, there were 4 telewindows and a waiting area with chairs that were the specific shade of mauve that suggested someone had made a decision in 1994 and not revisited it. Miriam sat in one of the mauve chairs and waited. A woman named Denise led her to a small office. She was perhaps 45, careful and professional, and when Miriam explained what she had and who she was and what she needed, Denise typed for a while and then looked up. "This account is in excellent standing," she said. Miriam waited. The primary holder was, she looked at the screen, Raymond Arthur Calloway, who passed away 6 years ago. "Yes. There's a beneficiary designation on the account. Sole beneficiary. Your name." Miriam nodded. "Are you all right?" Denise asked. "I'm working on it," Miriam said. Denise turned the screen slightly so Miriam could see the balance. It was not a fortune. She was clear-eyed about that even as she looked at the number. She was the daughter of a postal worker. And she knew the mathematics of what 40-some years of modest deposits looked like even with compound interest. It was not what had been taken. It was not the retirement fund, the joint savings, the years of her own income that had disappeared. But it was something. It was enough to make a beginning. Enough to pay rent on a small place while she figured out the legal path forward. Enough to represent a kind of floor, the thing below which she could not fall, because her father had quietly made sure the floor existed. She thought about him calling the credit union twice a year. January and July, she imagined, because those were the months he had always used for practical tasks, insurance renewals, car registrations. The maintenance appointments he kept in a small calendar on the kitchen wall. She imagined him picking up the phone in the kitchen of their house on Pembroke Street, asking to speak with someone in accounts, giving her name, confirming that the account was still intact and unaltered. 30 years of twice-a-year phone calls. 60 phone calls. 60 small acts of protection that she had known nothing about. She signed the paperwork to have the account transferred to her name alone, and she sat in the parking lot of Harmon Federal Credit Union for a while, watching the flag move against the grey sky. She did not cry here. She had done her crying at the ferry dock. This was something different, something that existed in the space between grief and gratitude, where you don't have a clean word for what you're feeling because what you're feeling is too specific to the shape of your actual life. She drove back to Caldwell Bay. She could have gone home, to Greer Street, to the house that was still technically hers during the proceedings, to the room she had arranged over 15 years into something that looked like a life. But she found herself on Linden Shore Road again, in the early evening, the October light doing what October light does, burning low and amber over the water, making everything look like the end of something. The ferry dock was empty, as it always was. She parked and walked out onto it, farther than she had the day before. The planks held. They complained under her feet, a long, slow groaning that felt more conversational than alarming. The heron was gone. The water was very still in the protected shallows, and further out it moved in long, lazy swells that had come from somewhere far away. She stood at the end of the dock for a long time. She thought about the letter. She had read it 4 times now, in the car and at Clara's kitchen table and once in the parking lot of the credit union. And each time she had found something slightly different in it, not new information, but a new angle from which to understand what it contained. I don't know if you'll need this. I hope you don't. She thought about what it meant to prepare for something you hope will never happen. To quietly, persistently protect someone against a future you can only guess at. There was no drama in it. There was no moment of confrontation or announcement. Her father had simply decided, at some point before she had even met Daniel, that the world was uncertain and that love, real love, meant building something that could stand up to the uncertainty without requiring you to predict exactly what form it would take. He had not known Daniel would empty the accounts. He had not known she would need a floor. He had simply known that she might, someday, need something that was only ever hers. She thought about the marriage, not with the fresh anger she had been living inside for the past weeks, but from a greater distance. The way you look at a landscape from a height and can see the shapes you couldn't see when you were standing inside them. She had not been deceived in the simple sense. She had been something more complicated. She had trusted, genuinely and not naively, and the trust had been met with something that was not its equivalent. That was true. And it was painful in a specific way that would take time to fully understand. But also true. Her father had seen it, or had seen the possibility of it, and had said nothing out of love, and had done something out of love, and the two things sat side by side in her now. The wound and the gift, and she was not sure she would ever fully separate them. The light was almost gone. She thought about Sasha, who had called twice today and whom she needed to call back, needed to tell that things were not as empty as they had appeared, that there was a flaw. That the flaw had been built by a man who was gone now but who had been thinking of her in January and July for 30 years. She thought about the ledger, the marble pattern cover, the columns of dates and numbers in her father's careful handwriting. 40 years of entries. Not a single month missed. She had looked for gaps and found none. There had been months where the amount was smaller, months where it was clearly a sacrifice to put anything in at all. But there had not been a month where he had simply not done it. The ferry dock creaked. She looked at the end of the dock, where the planks just stopped, no railing, no barrier, just the edge of the wood and then the water beyond. 11 years ago, the ferry had been here, and people had stepped from this dock onto a boat and crossed to the other side, and it had been ordinary and unremarkable. The way necessary things often are. Now there was only the water. But the dock was still here. It had not been maintained. It had not been designated a landmark or been given any formal recognition. It simply had not been torn down, and so it still stood, warped and grey and complaining underfoot. But standing, And people still came to it when they needed somewhere to stand that was outside their ordinary life. Somewhere that was connected to the water's long patience and the light's slow movement, and whatever it was that old places hold on behalf of the people who remember them. She turned and walked back to her car. She had calls to make. She had a lawyer who needed to know about the account. She had a daughter who needed to hear her mother's voice. She had, she realized, a future that was smaller than she had expected and more solid than she had feared. And the difference between those two things was not luck or resolution but the quiet, unannounced work of someone who had loved her without needing her to know it. She sat in the car and called Sasha first. "Mom," Sasha said. "Are you okay?" "I'm at the ferry dock," Miriam said. "I know. You always go there." She hadn't known that Sasha knew that. She hadn't known she had always gone there. But as soon as Sasha said it, she understood it was true, that this place had been hers in some necessary way for a long time, that she had been returning to it without marking the returns. The way you return to any place that holds something for you. "I found something," Miriam said. "I need to tell you about your grandfather." The dock is still there. Miriam drove past it occasionally in the months that followed. The legal months, the paperwork months. The months of figuring out how a life reorganizes itself when the shape you gave it turns out not to have been the shape it was. She did not stop every time. But she looked. She had the ledger at home now, on the shelf in the small apartment she rented on the north side of town, a place with tall windows and afternoon light and a kitchen that smelled, the first morning, of someone else's coffee, which she took as a beginning rather than a lack. The ledger sat between two books she loved. She didn't read it often. She didn't need to. But she knew it was there, and knowing it was there was its own kind of companionship, the presence of something that documented a love she had been inside of without fully understanding it. She thought sometimes about the phone calls. January and July. Her father's voice, careful and unhurried, asking a question that must have seemed to the bank employees on the other end like a small and slightly peculiar request. Confirming. Making sure. Doing the one thing that was his to do and doing it without ceremony or record or any expectation that it would ever be acknowledged. Perhaps that is what love looks like when it has grown past the need to be seen. Not the grand gesture, not the declared devotion, but the twice-a-year phone call. The ledger with no missing months. The letter written in a declining hand, to a daughter who was happy and wouldn't need it yet. She drove past the dock in December, and snow was sitting on the grey planks, and the water was dark and still. And the whole thing looked like something from a photograph of a life that had once been ordinary and had since become quietly remarkable. She didn't stop. She kept driving. But she thought, how many people are being protected by something they don't know about yet? How many fathers are making the twice-a-year phone call? How much love is happening, right now, in the form of patience, in the form of a ledger with no missing months, that the people being loved won't find until they need it most? The dock disappeared in her rearview mirror. The road curved inland, toward home. Some love doesn't announce itself. It simply builds quietly, keeps faithfully, and waits, without impatience, without expectation, for the day when the person it was built for finally drives to the edge of the water, and breaks open, and finds the floor.